Dardenne. He was appointed Commissioner of the Division of Administration in January 2016 by Governor John Bell Edwards. Before that, he served 8 years as Louisiana's Lieutenant Governor, 4 years as Secretary of State, 15 years as a state senator, and 3 years as a Baton Rouge Metro Councilman. He's an attorney and a graduate of Louisiana State University and the LSU Law Center. He's also a Louisiana history buff and often gives presentations about the state's history, including one titled Why Louisiana Ain't Mississippi. In addition, Jay's a regular contributor to editorial cartoonist Walt Hamilton's caption writing contest and a regular entrant in the annual Bulwer Lytton Fiction Contest. For those of you unfamiliar with the contest, it's named after Edward Bulwer Lytton, a Victorian writer notable for starting a novel with the much maligned phrase, "It was a dark and stormy night." And in fact, Jay received a dishonorable mention in the vile puns category in the 2020 Bulwer Lytton contest. So please help me welcome Jay Dardenne.
Thank you, Karen. It's always good to be with you here at the Press Club, and I appreciate the invitation to join you today. Unfortunately, I didn't strike gold in the Bulwer Lytton contest this year. I just saw the 21 results, and I didn't make it. I had a couple of entries, but didn't make it this go around, so I'll try again next time. But I'll talk to you about much less interesting subjects today than vile puns and the history of Louisiana. I'll talk a little bit about the state budget and then talk about the American Rescue Plan, which has really gotten relatively little coverage in the press since that money came down from Washington. So I'll take a little time and talk about how we're going to spend that money based upon what the legislature did and based upon the plans that we've put together, and then I'll be happy to obviously take your questions on those things or anything else. The Revenue Estimating Conference last met in May of 21. At that meeting, we wound up recognizing the state's, an increase in the state's revenue forecast for calendar year 21, which ended on June 30th. The increase was about $346 million over where it had been previously set at the outset of the pandemic. It makes sense that when the pandemic hit, the REC lowered the forecast because we knew it was going to be a difficult economic year for the state. So our expectations were relatively low at the beginning of the 21 fiscal year. They improved dramatically toward the end of the year, the 21 year, and we had this $346 million number. We've now closed out the books on 21. It takes the entire month of July and well into August for us to close the state books when the fiscal year ends on June 30th. So we're anxiously awaiting what those final numbers are going to look like, and we're literally about a week away from knowing what those numbers will be, but I'm very confident in saying to you that we'll probably see another increase in the forecast beyond where we were in May of 21 by about several $100 million. So I do think we will wind up with a very significant surplus for calendar year 21, which will be spent by the legislature in next year's legislative session. And of course, the spending will be restricted to what the Constitution provides, which means we'll make another contribution to the rainy day fund, another contribution to the unfunded accrued liability, and then the Constitution specifies how those dollars would otherwise be spent. We will once again recommend that the remaining money be spent on infrastructure projects, one-time expenditures. We've always thought it was a good idea to use those dollars on deferred maintenance in particular. The legislature has not agreed with the amount that we would like to see spent on deferred maintenance. I hope that that'll improve next year because that is really a way that we invest in our infrastructure and avoid having to incur a lot of the expenses that we otherwise must do because we're simply not taking care of things as problems arise. The rainy day fund is right now at $545 million. That's well over $100 million more than when the governor took office and we faced the real challenge that we had in 2016. We'll be making another contribution to that rainy day fund, so it'll increase even more. So we're at a very good point in Louisiana in terms of how we've restored our rainy day fund and the way in which we're spending these repeated budget surpluses that we've had. It's been a long time since 5 or so years ago in 2016 when we were talking about the devastating cuts that we were facing and the need to raise revenue, and those days are behind us. somewhat surprisingly in the midst of the pandemic, but we have continued to perform well economically, and that's a very encouraging thing for the state. The REC will meet again at some point in the not too distant future. I'm no longer the chair of the REC. The speaker is now the chair, so he'll call the meeting. But we'll need to have a meeting pretty soon because we usually take action on what the legislature has done during its time in session, and we haven't done that yet. So in addition to recognizing legislative action, it will also probably be appropriate for us to consider some increase in the forecast based upon what we think the economy is going to continue to do. But that remains to be seen whether we'll increase the 22 forecast or not. Those numbers really kind of belie something I know you'd probably be interested in asking me, so I'll go ahead and comment on it based upon what the Bond Commission did last week in not approving those priority one projects. One of the stated reasons was we needed to evaluate those projects and look out for the fiscal of the state, but the reality is the fiscal of the state is in very good shape, as is our capital outlay program. And those projects in New Orleans and the one project in Lafayette that were not approved last week represent ongoing projects that we were simply reauthorizing. Never have we not, as a bond commission, as far as I can remember or have knowledge of, we've never not approved those reauthorizations when they come up to be reauthorized because they represent projects that are underway, bills that have been incurred, and new work that needs to begin in order to keep the projects on schedule. There's some very critical projects, obviously, in New Orleans that were delayed last month. It's not going to be fatal for the projects. It's not going to end the projects. And now that we've had a chance to review the bills that were due, I can tell you that we don't have huge numbers of bills that are not being paid right now, but we will if those projects are not approved, hopefully at the September meeting, because there's significant work that's underway and bills that are waiting to be paid that we will not have the capacity or the ability legally to pay unless and until those projects are approved at the Bond Commission. So I think we're just playing a game, a waiting game, and I anticipate that all those projects ultimately will be approved and they'll be able to go forward without missing a beat. If that doesn't happen, though, it will be unprecedented, and we will literally stop projects in their midst, and we will not have dollars to pay people, contractors, business people, primarily in Louisiana, who have done work and obviously expect to be paid. So I'm certainly hoping that that's going to take care of itself in the not too distant future, hopefully at the September meeting. Now let me turn my attention to the American Rescue Plan. The Congress of the United States has provided more revenue to states and territories and cities and municipalities and towns and villages and nooks and crannies across America than it has ever done, probably since the New Deal. The amount of money that is going to state governments and local governments is just astounding. As you know, over $3 billion coming to the state of Louisiana. The legislature has authorized the expenditure of $1.6 billion of that $3 billion in its 22 budget. So we still have that remaining approximately half of the $3 billion yet to be appropriated by the legislature. And as they meet in the future, they can determine whether or not they want to reinvest in the projects and the investments that have already taken place, or whether they want to put the money on something new that is authorized by the Act. $490 million went to the Unemployment Trust Fund to restore a base for that fund, and it will eventually build itself back up, hopefully, to the $1 billion that existed before the pandemic started. $563 million went to the Department of Transportation and Development. And then the legislature allocated the balance of the money to certain particular initiatives that require administration and require applications by the various entities who are entitled to that money. First and foremost was the $300 million that went to the Water Sector Commission. The Water Sector Commission was created, 10 members of the legislature, 5 from each house, to make recommendations on how to fund water and sewer projects across Louisiana. The ultimate authority for spending that money by law is vested in the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget. So this 10-member legislative committee will make recommendations to the JLCD, which will then have the power to issue these grants. All of that will be based upon recommendations that we will make, that the administration will make. I say the administration, it's actually, and I'll explain the makeup of the group, but it's basically those who are charged with administering this money, developing a mechanism for grading the projects and suggesting to the commission and then to the legislative committee on the budget how the money should be spent. The entities that are involved in making the recommendation are the Department of Health and the Department of Health and the Department of Environmental Quality. Health administers water programs in the state. DEQ administers the sewer programs in the state. So those engineers within those departments who have expertise in these areas are going to grade all the various applications that come in. They will be reviewed by our facility planning office led by Mark Moses and Jason Suter. And those recommendations all will be reviewed by our internal auditor and her staff to make the recommendations that ultimately will go to these two committees. The application process began on August 1st. It will end, the first tranche at least, will end on September 24th. At which time our group will begin reviewing all the projects and make its recommendations by November 8th to the commission. The commission will then make the recommendation to the JLCD. Now, the impetus behind these dollars is to address the significant water and sewer challenges that we have in the state. And to that end, the methodology that's been established for grading the projects is as follows. Severity in need is going to be graded 40%. Consolidating systems, which is a great necessity, particularly in our rural areas, is going to be worth 20%. Resiliency is worth 10%. Sustainability, 15%. Readiness to proceed, 15%. And if there is an increased local share provided by the local governmental entity, an additional 15% can be allocated. That comes to more than 100%, but it is based upon the flexibility of consolidation and increased local share that also gets bonus points, if you will, if that's part of your application. So the aim of the game, from our standpoint, will be to find the most needy projects and those entities that are most willing to consolidate in order to save money, improve efficiency, and the ability to monitor the systems and charge an adequate amount to the constituency to make certain that they can take care of their programs. There is a minimum requirement of a 25% match by these local entities. That can be waived by the commission and by the joint legislative committee, but absent that waiver, a 25% local match is required. And the motivation behind this is the fact that local governmental entities, as I'll mention in just a little while, receive a huge amount of money from the federal government. And the purpose of the local match is to incentivize those local governments to use a significant portion of those dollars as a local match within the water and sewer program. So we're hopeful that that will provide an adequate incentive. The next allocation by the legislature was for tourism. $77.5 million for tourism. $15 million of which was allocated directly to the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. So the Lieutenant Governor's budget, which really did not sustain a significant loss during the COVID year, is able to give an additional $15 million to be able to market and promote the state in what is going to be a hugely competitive environment worldwide for tourism dollars. Because as we know, the whole world has been impacted by the pandemic, and everybody's going to be anxious to encourage people to come visit their respective venues. So this will eventually be money well spent. It does not need to be spent immediately because people don't seem to be back in the traveling mode completely yet, but eventually those dollars will be for that purpose. The remaining $60 million is designed to go to market and promote the state. And it is to go to our local CVBs. By law, the money can only go to a Convention and Visitors Bureau, a Convention and Visitors Commission, or what's deemed an official destination marketing organization. There are 48 of such entities in the state. A number of parishes have combined their tourism efforts, so we don't have 64. That list represents virtually every parish of the state in what they do in their respective jurisdictions to promote travel. The $60 million is to be allocated based upon a negative economic impact that was sustained by each of these entities. That will be based upon comparing their audited financial statements for 2019 with their audited financial statements for 2020. A very simple mathematical computation. Whatever that difference is will be the amount to which that bureau or that organization, that commission will be entitled to. We work very closely with the Louisiana Travel Association and the Lieutenant Governor's Office to develop this program. It is with everybody's agreement that it was presented to the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget a week or so ago to get their approval. If there is still money left after that allocation is made, and we think there will be because the CVBs tell us that their economic loss does not come to the entire $60 million, it's probably about half of that, then the remaining dollars will be allocated based upon submissions to each of those local entities who will make decisions how to best use the money on a pro rata basis in their respective jurisdictions. So for example, a CVB may be able to make a grant to a particular festival or to a particular event that is planned in their area. Or they may be able to use that money for their own budget for additional marketing and advertising. All concerned believe it's a very appropriate and important way that we can incentivize travelers to return to Louisiana. And I'm looking for great returns on these particular investments. There's a $50 million allocation to the ports of Louisiana, $5 million of which is designed to go for port security, although there remains a question as to whether or not that port security portion can even be met because there was a time limit on when these expenditures were to be made, and it's based, we believe, on reimbursement. In talking with the Ports Association of Louisiana, we believe that the entire $50 million will probably not be used because it's based upon lost revenue of the ports as well, and their dollars may not come to that full amount. So there may be some leftover money that will be reallocated by the legislature at some point in time in that program. Now that represents the largest portions of the money that's been authorized by the legislature, the $1.6 million in the 22 budget. There was an entirely separate allocation for broadband of about $180 million. The legislature opted to only authorize the expenditure of $90 million of that 180 in 22. So $90 million remains for broadband yet to be appropriated. The $90 million, though, was given to the Gumbo Fund that was created legislatively, and it's an acronym for basically an intent to stimulate internet activity in broadband in rural areas of this state. And the group, and it's a three-man group that we have within the division, that, as you know, Beneath Anger is heading that initiative. We hired him, and he hired 2 additional people that are coordinating that entire effort. It's made great progress already. Connect.la.gov is a toolkit that has been created and published for local governments to understand how best they can access this money and what it is designed to do. A website will be open in early September that governmental entities can apply for well, not governmental entities, that providers can apply for these dollars to serve particular local governmental entities. There'll be a portal, as there will be for our other dollars, that they'll be required to apply through. That portal will be open basically through the months of November and January. Awards will be made in mid-January, and payments can be expected in early February. So a fairly aggressive timeline to get those dollars out as well. And there's still potentially more dollars to come for broadband if you listen to the discussion that's taking place at the congressional level. Finally, I mentioned the money for local governments. An amazing amount of money literally to every entity in America, from New York City all the way to the village of Mound in Louisiana, gets a particular dollar allocation. There are dollars allocated on a formula basis, a pro rata basis for every village, town, city in America. And that includes, obviously, Louisiana. 14 of our cities were given direct allocations. And they got significant sums of money. Baton Rouge, Shreveport, New Orleans, all the way down to Thibodeau got money directly. Every other entity in the state has an allocation that flows through the Division of Administration to those local entities. And to date, we've paid out about $127 million of those dollars. We actually have 10 villages that have not yet submitted the application to be paid. We're hoping that they will do so because that money is specifically allocated to them and can go nowhere else. The balance of the money we expect to be paid by the end of September based upon the applications of all these local governmental entities. So you can see there's a huge amount of money that's available to the state right now. With the infrastructure package that's being debated in Congress right now, in all likelihood will be a significant amount of additional dollars coming down, probably restricted into the areas of infrastructure, which is a very good thing, and that would include broadband. But we may very well have the opportunity for significantly more dollars coming to the state of Louisiana. They will in all likelihood, though, require a match. So we'll have to be very cognizant of what we do with our surplus funds, what we do in the budgetary process, in order to make certain that we can meet the match of whatever may be coming from the infrastructure program. So that's a very quick look at our economic status right now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
So you brought up the bond commission delay of funding, and you said it essentially, the state is doing well fiscally, so do you know why they voted to do that when it seems like there wasn't really a good reason for that?
Well, that answer rests with the people who voted to vote that way, but they have said, I've read their public comments, I was not at the meeting. Rick Jimson represented me at the meeting because I was out of town, but the public comments seem to indicate that an acknowledgement in part that it was trying to send a message to New Orleans. There was also some statements that they wanted to look further at the projects. You'll have to ask them what their motivation was, but it seems to me it was designed to send a message to New Orleans because of the dissatisfaction with the policies that are taking place there. At the end of the day, though, those projects, I believe, are going to be approved. They're that important to the state, and they also would preclude other projects from being able to move forward unless they are approved, because they're all in priority one, which means those priority one projects have to be completed before you get to other projects. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question, but I'll try to remember next time. Yes, sir.
How would the state handle vaccine requirements for employees now that the Pfizer vaccine has been FDA approved?
As you can imagine, that's been a hot topic of discussion in anticipation of the approval. The question was, how's the state going to handle, I think you said, vaccines for employees?
Yeah.
Now that the Pfizer vaccination has been approved. It's been a topic we have obviously been discussing for some time. We don't have a formal plan in place yet. We will have one in the not too distant future. In all likelihood, it will require mandatory testing for employees who are not willing to be vaccinated. But the details of that have not yet been worked out. It's obviously something that we're going to be discussing as we move to this next phase when now that Pfizer's been approved and presumably Moderna will be approved and maybe J&J at some point down the line as well.
Well, I was going to ask that question too, but I mean, are you going to require state workers to be vaccinated?
Are we going to require state workers to be vaccinated? That has not been decided yet. I mean, in the event that they are not required to be vaccinated, we're still going to say if you're not vaccinated, there's going to be a mandatory testing program set up for you. Because we believe it that important, and we think this ought to be an incentive for people who have delayed the vaccination to now get vaccinated, since the FDA and CDC are recognizing that vaccines are safe and effective.
Timeline for this decision?
No, but I think it'll be sooner rather than later. Obviously, we've been contemplating this happening, and it's something we're talking about, and we've been talking about it as recently as this week, even today. So I think you're going to see some announcement from the governor in the not too distant future.
Following up on Ms. Hack's question regarding the bond commission, one of the delays was the remaining $28,300,000 in construction for the Superdome. You said you think that that's going to ultimately happen. Could there be a ramification of the delay? Will it cause any problems with Super Bowl or
The question is, the bond commission action last week had delayed payment of an additional $28 million to the Superdome is that going to have any consequences on the construction schedule and perhaps impact the Super Bowl or other events? And the answer is no, unless it is ultimately not approved. The time frame for the continuation of construction is not going to be dramatically affected by this delay, assuming it's only this 1 month delay. If something happens in September or not too soon or quickly after that, it's not going to have an impact on the Super Bowl on the Final Four, but it is imperative that those dollars be recognized so that the Superdome project can be completed. If you've been following it, you know that it's already been partially completed in phases, but we have to move to the next phases. We have to let contracts to make certain that we stay on schedule, to make certain those improvements are completed before the Super Bowl arises. So it's very important. It's not something we ought to be playing games with, no pun intended. We just need to get busy with it and make certain they're able to complete that work. And I feel pretty confident that they will. Linda?
Jay, on the discussion of mandatory testing, how many employees do you all have oversight of in the state government, and which ones wouldn't be affected by whatever mandate government puts?
The question is, how many employees do we have that could be affected by mandatory vaccinations, and how many would not be affected by whatever policy we put in place? And the answer is I don't know. I mean, I know we have 30-some-odd thousand employees overall statewide. We have a number of state employees that have already been vaccinated, and we know that because of self-disclosure by those who have been vaccinated. But I can't tell you exactly how that's going to be implemented or any of the specifics, but obviously before a decision is made to move forward, those details will have to be worked out. It'll be something the state will have to pay for. It would not be something that would be passed on to the employees.
But on that, do y'all have authority over civil service workers, for example, or is that something where the civil service commission would have to get involved?
Does the administration have control over civil service employees, or does the civil service commission have to be involved in that issue? Is the question, and the answer is one of the things we're talking about, one of the things we're looking at. That's why I'm not prepared to say any more than that right now, because the announcement just happened this morning, and the plan is still under formulation, and I know the governor will make the announcement at the time that it's appropriate to do so. Yes.
I think there's been a recent push on the part of Attorney General Jeff Landry to get some litigation settled in which the state was named as defendant. We saw on Channel 2 a high-profile case involving the DPS doctor that was settled. It's been said that there may be concern over the escalating level of legal fees that have been incurred to defend these suits that may be motivating the change to look to settle. Is your office in any way pushing toward expediting settlements as a means to curtail some of those legal expenses that have been incurred to defend the lawsuits?
The question is whether my office is involved in any discussion that's underway about settling some pending lawsuits that have generated a significant amount of legal fees. And the answer is no, we're not involved. That's up to the Attorney General's office, and they have complete discretion on settling those cases as it stands right now. John?
I don't know if it was an extremely pressing problem in Louisiana, but the eviction money, the recovery money from evictions, a lot of it nationwide wasn't released. Where do we stand in Louisiana on that? Is that part of that fund you were talking about?
Yes, the question is about the money that was allocated by the federal government for eviction relief and lessors and lessees. Is that under our purview, and how do we stand compared to what other states have experienced? It is not part of the dollars that I was talking about specifically today, but it is something that's under the administration of our office. Originally, it was to be handled by the Louisiana Housing Corporation in connection with our Office of Community Development. The LHC contracted with us, with the Office of Community Development, to manage that program. So we are now in charge of it and handling it. And it is now moving a lot quicker and a lot more productively than it was at the outset. And it's one of those programs that's very difficult to manage and very difficult to drive the money where it needs to be, because you have to get lessors and lessees to both come together and identify themselves as being in that relationship to make certain that the payment is made to the right person, that you're not paying somebody who's not entitled to get it. So it's a cumbersome and difficult procedural challenge to deal with that, but that's precisely what we're doing. We have vendors who have been contracted to do that job, and they're underway with that work, and we're monitoring it very carefully.
Say on the water system program, can you say how many applications y'all have already received? And I know obviously the global world of problems in the water systems exceed the amount of money that's available, but do you already have more applications than there is money available?
This is hot off the press. I meant to mention this in my remarks because I just requested this right before I leave. We have as of right now, we have 182 applications for disbursement. We have actually 8 that are under final review that we've already taken through our process, 14 more that are pending additional documentation. So we believe we have about 70 entities that have not yet submitted the required documentation. So we've had a good response. There's a huge interest in this program, as you can imagine, because we have so many water systems that are challenged. And there is also great incentive by a number of engineers in the state to make certain this project moves forward because it's a lot of work for them. So you have the combination of need at the governmental level and the private sector saying, we can help you get there. So there's been a great deal of interest in the program, and I think at the end of the day, we will have applications probably from everybody who is eligible. It is not going to be an easy task to determine who should get the grants, because we do have a limited amount of money, $300 million, and we have, I don't remember the exact number, but it's well over $1 billion, probably multiple billions, I'm just not remembering the number right now, of needs for water and sewer systems in the state. So there's not going to be enough money to address everything. Our intent will be to identify the most worthy and needy projects in accordance with the percentage allocation we set forth in determining who gets the grants. I'm hoping that it will remain as objective a process as possible, as opposed to an overly political process. But clearly, because of the way in which legislation is constructed, the Water Sector Commission makes a recommendation. It can be different from the suggestions we make. The commission recommendations must go to JLCB, and theoretically those decisions could be different from that recommended by the commission. So it's going to be involved in a relatively intricate process to determine who gets a limited amount of money.
So you already mentioned that there's going to be a surplus of funds for the legislature to kind of, play around with next year, and all these Rescue Act dollars, not every dollar is going to be used that they've already allocated. You touched on infrastructure, but what are some other things, in your opinion, that you think that lawmakers should really be focusing on using this money that we don't always get to have?
Nothing but infrastructure. I mean, the most important need in the state for one-time money is for infrastructure needs, because we know the difficulties we have with our roads, our bridges, our ports, our broadband. All these needs are much greater than what we have dollars for, and these have to be viewed as one-time funds because that's exactly what they are. And there are limitations on how, for example, the surplus can be spent anyway, constitutional limitations that will drive those dollars to primarily infrastructure projects. The remaining money that we have from the ARP program is also restricted by the federal language on what it can be used for. So none of this money will be plugged into our operating budget. And I think it can all be used for very worthy projects. It's just going to be a question of which ones are they, and how much are we going to be able to do, for example, on the mega projects, the big projects that we're talking about, like the bridges that cost multiple billions of dollars. How are we going to fund those programs with these dollars? And there's going to be some money to get started on those, there's no doubt. The legislature's already created a mechanism for some additional funding for those projects. So I think we're well on the way to seeing some things actually happen in Louisiana that have been long overdue.
Got any feel for which congressmen are going to support this when it goes to the House?
Do I have any idea which congressmen are going to support the plan when it goes to the House? No, I have no idea.
The delegation hasn't talked to you all about it.
They hadn't talked to me. I'm not sure if the governor's been in discussions with them. The governor's been very active in promoting passage of the act, knowing the benefits it will bring to the state. But I can't speak to any communication with the individual congressmen and what they may do. Yes, sir.
Has any consideration been given to requiring vaccination as a condition of access to state facilities such as state parks and campgrounds?
Has any consideration been given to requiring vaccination for entry into state facilities like state parks and state campgrounds? The state parks are under the purview of the Lieutenant Governor, so he would be the one who would have to make the decision on that regard unless the Governor issued an executive order that required it. And I think that would be dependent upon whether or not there's some type of mandatory vaccination order for everybody, which I think is probably unlikely based upon the law the way it stands. But that remains to be seen. I think the question of trying to encourage people, as has been done over the course of the past several months, has not been as effective as we'd like it to be in terms of asking people to voluntarily comply. Hopefully, more information is made available. The tragedies that are being described every day that are taking place in the state right now, as well as the potential for having to be tested if you're not vaccinated in order to get into certain events, might be an additional incentive for people. I hope it will be.
Any other questions?
Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.